Hi, we continue with our transition tales as we enter into the curious story in Genesis 23 of Abraham negotiating with the Hittites for a burial place for Sarah, who has now died at the age of 127. So before we enter into our story, let's give some context. If you haven't watched the introduction to this section in the last video, I really encourage you to do so, where I was trying to point out some of the ways that these chapters are fit together, even though some scholars would see them as a potpourri of various things from different authors in different times. I think they fit together very nicely, although the confusion that readers often experience around names and places, it suggested last time, is intentional here, because there is much that would be confused in Abraham's mind now that his wife is dead and his children are scattered, and in the audience's mind, presumably either in exile or in the post-exilic situation under Persian rule, where they're not sure where home is, they're not sure who their own people are, and they're not sure what God's will is. So God is not in this story at all. It's a completely secular story in that sense. Not only is God not an active character, Yahweh or Elohim are never mentioned. But it's part of this overarching picture here of what Abraham needs to be doing. And if we go back and look at the promises by categories that we saw last time, virtually none of these have been fulfilled other than the fact he literally had two sons, but as far as he knows, those are both gone. So what we'll see in this chapter is his attempt to bring fulfillment to the promise of Yahweh to acquire land, although what he'd been promised is all you can see, or land from the Nile to the Euphrates, which is, say, from Egypt to Iraq, and what he ends up here is a cave with a field and a few trees. So whether we see that as a down payment on the land or Abraham's attempt again to make things happen in the absence of Yahweh's promise, just like he went into Hagar to produce Ishmael back in chapter 16. And similarly in this chapter we can see that it would be a question of becoming a great nation, or in the next chapter rather, in chapter 24, to have this continue. So although Isaac is away from him, we'll find out that he certainly knows where Isaac is, and all of chapter 24 will be about trying to keep this going another generation, to find a woman to be Isaac's partner so this can continue. So in many ways that's what ties us together, is old Abraham trying the best he can to fulfill those promises, but also with the exigency of his beloved wife's death here, and in the hot sun indeed, which creates a major problem. So as we look at our chapter here, and I'm going to rely a lot, as I've been highlighting, on Meyer Sternberg for this, but also on Sarna, and you have quotes from both of them on the top two Jewish scholars of previous generation for Sarna, and although Sternberg wrote this in the early 90s, he's still around. But both of these quotes establish something of what's important here, so I'd like to read them both. First from Sarna. Abraham labors under two disabilities that derive from his status as an alien. He cannot avail himself of local burial facilities without municipal permission, and he cannot acquire land. Second, even if these restrictions were to be overcome, he would still face the problem of procuring an inheritable estate to be used by future generations, for an alien could not normally own land in perpetuity. Although, parenthetically, I'd question whether the Leviticus reference is relevant for the Hittites here. Third, apart from legal problems, there is still to be encountered the reluctance of landowners to part with their property. So that from Sarna, and after that from Sternberg. We readers have to infer and coordinate a set of three Hittite motives, or rather three levels or layers of motive, one atop the other: politeness, politics, and profits. These three P's, all secretly alien if not opposed to the imperative of burial, mark a descending order along various related scales. First, transparence, each veils the next in depth. Two, seemliness. Third, senses of hear us, my Lord, attention, obedience, and understanding. The uglier the message behind the speaking, the larger the role played by the hearing. So what that's implying here is that we as readers are going to have to pay very close attention. Perhaps Abraham and the Hittites, and Ephraim in particular, understand what's going on without help, just like the people from the cultural context in which you go to a marketplace and barter with the seller understand what's going on, but a stranger might not. And we as readers are certainly strangers to this ancient negotiation. So we will need to pay more attention than probably Abraham and the Hittites have to what's going on here. We'll also see the key words in this chapter, and there are many key words that are really important, because by the end of this is going to have a legal-like sounding conclusion. It's plainly not literally a legal conclusion. There's no legal apparatus, either Israelite, which wouldn't exist yet, or Hittite, and we're not even sure who these Hittites are, as I'll explore in a moment. and there's certainly no court or formality. But certainly in terms of the text of Genesis itself, it's establishing something like that. In a phrase that will be repeated regularly throughout, as we saw on this chart last time with the question of Mamre repeated throughout the book of Genesis here, and highlighting each time that Abraham bought from Ephron the Hittite, all the way to the last chapter of the book. So as we look at this, let's keep these scenes and structures up, and we're just going to look at the first part of it. I'm actually not going to look at 1 to 6 here. We're just going to look at 1 to 4. In fact, let's keep the keywords up so we can follow that there. So we have to, before we get into the question of the burial, we have to recognize what the text is telling us about Sarah. And we already saw last time how the three people, Isaac, Sarah, and Abraham, are all in very different places. Isaac will be told is settling here in Beer Lahai Roi. The father Abraham is here in Beersheba, and as we can see in verse 2 on the left side of the screen, Sarah, as a dead person, is here in the variously named Mamre, Hebron, and Kiriath Arba. And as the chart I was just showing you and I was talking about in the last video, the multiplicity of names is perhaps meant to be confusing to establish in readers' and listeners' minds a sense of their own confusion. So how she's described here is very plain and not like we see in other places. As my note below says, Sarah's life is not noted with joyous phrases. Let's look at the death of Abraham in 25:8 for comparison, where we see here he breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and gathered to his people. So those little phrases, a good old age and full of years, is highlighting a complete life. But we don't hear anything. We just hear the simple fact of this here. So Sarah was last mentioned at 21:12 after the situation with Hagar and Ishmael, and we've not heard a word what she thought about the binding of Isaac. But the Midrash suggests that her death, as my note here has, from the shock of being told by Satan that Abraham had killed Isaac, and that from the Targum Yonasan that we see there. So she lived 127 years, and there are a couple of interesting things about this. Umberto Cassuto, who's done the most of anybody that I'm aware of to highlight how the various year lengths throughout Genesis are a number play in the Babylonian number system, and here he points out how it's 120, which is twice the base 60 number system of the Babylonians, plus the perfect number of 7. But it also is 5 times 5 times 4, plus 3 times 3 times 3. Does that matter? Well, when we look at the ages of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when they die, maybe it will be. Also, gleaning from my note below, Sarah was mentioned to be 90 at Isaac's birth back in 1717. Thus, when she dies when he's 37, which highlights that it's been 20 years or so. We understood that Isaac was a teenager when Abraham and he walked up to the mountain, and now all this time has passed. Even though a few verses have passed, they've lived apart for a long, long time. And as Wenham notes below, Sarah is the only patriarch's wife whose age at death is recorded. And we'll learn later from 5:20 that it's 3 years before Isaac marries Rebekah at the age of 40. So gathering all the data, we can put that together. There's a curious thing in the Hebrew, too, that the word shana for years is 4 times here. It often separates out for years, like 100 years and 27 years. But then it's like this, 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. And the Midrash argues this: it is to teach that each term must be interpreted independently. At 100, she was like a woman of 20 with relation to sin, and at 20, she was like 7 in relation to beauty. That's from Chaya, Sarah, the life of Sarah, citing the medieval interpreter Rashi. And the Midrash in general presents Sarah as perfect, in their own words, at least in English translation, as perfect. So I'll have no criticism of Sarah for how she treated Hagar or how she treated Abraham. It just sees her as the expression of perfection. I note here, too, that we can see it in English, but it's also true in the Hebrew, that Sarah lived, or Sarah's life frames this as a little chiasm here. So Sarah's life, 127 years, yes, years. And we're told that before we're told that she died, which is a curious juxtaposition there, apparently dying alone, as Phyllis Tribble notes that Abraham must go in to mourn her. There's various midrashic traditions, as my note below suggests, linking her death with the experience of the Akedah. As the one from the first one we have there says, a frustrated Satan lies to Sarah about Isaac. She wails 3 sobs and dies. That was hinted at in my note above. From another one, Satan disguises Isaac tells Sarah what Abraham tried to do, at which her soul fled away. And then finally Isaac returned and told her himself, no Satan, and she died of the news itself. Those from Viva Gottlieb Zornberg. And the fact that Satan is in these midrashes highlights Satan having its origin in the Persian period, that the midrash is much later than the New Testament, in fact, for those not familiar. So we're told here that she died at Kiriath Arba, and that's going back to the issue of the place here. It literally, Kiriath means 4 cities, but what Arba means we don't know. And Arba we don't. It's Aram. We'll see for the next chapter. We don't know. So just ignore what I just said there. And we note the different references here to Kiriath Arba, both back in Joshua, read as a proper noun there several times in Joshua, and it'll be in Nehemiah, which is from the Persian period. But the key issue is that it's apart from Abram, and we can see the distance here from these two places. How does he find out that she's dead? We have no idea. Is she dying alone? Does she have other women with her? We have no idea of that either. So much mystery in this. Just as we saw last time, we didn't know how Abraham found out that his brother's wife had 8 children during this time period. We have no idea how he finds out that Sarah died. Last time we were told that it was told Abram. We don't know here. Nothing. The narrator doesn't provide anything to say that Abraham was told that Sarah died. In Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron. And Hebron itself, we've seen earlier, it's 71 times in the Hebrew Scripture, but there's no mention of the altar here. Let's go back and see that earlier, the last time we saw it. Abram moved his tent, and of course he's with Sarah, but it's just describing him, and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar. Notice it's not termed Kiriath Arba here, but there's an altar noted there, and there's no sense of an altar here. You'd think that perhaps if he's going to mourn Sarah, that he would do something at the altar, but it's not mentioned. The highlight of the land of Canaan here, as many people have noted, warning in particular, the 7th use of the phrase, highlighting, as he notes, the first land acquisition fulfillment of the promises, as I've been noting. Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep, which breaks up the hendiadys here of mourn and weep, as many scholars have noted. It's used as hendiadys in 2 Samuel 1:12 for David mourning for Saul and Jonathan. As Wenham notes below, it suggests that Abraham did not just weep aloud, but carried out other traditional mourning customs, given the hendiadys. But what those traditional mourning customs, we don't know, since this is the first example of it in the Bible. There's also an irony here, as my note below has. Abraham might well have been mourning the death of his beloved son, but instead it is his beloved wife, with whom he does not speak in the text after the Akedah. And so there's an interesting little note from the Midrash here that the word for weep has the letter K in it, kaf, and the Midrash notes that for some reason in the manuscript it's written with a small kaf, and they interpret that as Abraham did not weep excessively or not publicly. The small letter is highlighting small weeping, and that's very characteristic of the Midrash there. So Abraham is faced with this situation. He's both grieving and mourning, and yet he has to do something with her dead body in the hot sun in this desert-like climate. This is not strictly desert as we see in the wilderness down here, but it's certainly hot. We don't know what time of year it is, but certainly a dead body in any time of the year there would be required immediate doing something with. And so we have this scene that unfolds. As it notes, my note below from Russell argues from Gluckman's theory of land tenure, based on fieldwork in Zambia, that the chapter can be understood in terms of traditions. I would suggest, though, that the question of whether fieldwork in Zambia is relevant to the burial practices of these Hittites and of Abraham is very tenuous at best, so we won't go down that road. So Abraham rose up from beside his dead, and that phrase, his dead, is a key word here. And as some have suggested, perhaps it's to prevent the text being associated with ancestor worship, as some other peoples do, so he doesn't refer to Sarah, and there's no sense of building a little image of her to worship her. But ancestor worship doesn't really seem to be the theme here. Relationship with the land and relationship with the neighbors seems to be the theme. And when he rises up from beside his dead, he suddenly says to the Hittites, and they come completely out of nowhere here. We saw them in chapter 15:20 as one of the peoples of Canaan, and some scholars have tried to connect the Hittites to the 2nd millennium BCE Hittite Empire, but almost all scholars suggest that has nothing to do with that here. That empire was long gone, and these are described as Canaanite peoples and not a major empire. So we really don't know a lot about these Hittites, but we know that they have a city. There's a city here, and yet it's not mentioned as city. And so suddenly Abraham is standing before a group of people we don't know. We don't know how many. Is it an entire civilization of them? And so it's a very strange scene that he's talking to them, and it recalls other encounters encounters in Genesis between one of our people, if you will, one of the people that become the ancestors of Israel, and cities. And of course, we recall that cities began with Cain, the first murderer, alienated from God, building a city. And so cities have been negative throughout Genesis, including the city built by the Tower people on the Babel story. But we've seen it more specifically, of course, with going into the cities in Egypt, where Abram at that time was afraid that the Egyptians would take his wife and kill him. And, of course, especially we saw Lot in Sodom, where he was treated as the alien he was and not listened to and threatened with death, he and his whole family, when he dared to allow other strangers into town. And we'll see later similar things like that when Jacob and his sons end up connected with Shechem and the Shechemites there. So this is one of a number of city encounters, and we'll see it again in the very next chapter, in chapter 24 as well. So what can we expect here? We can expect hostility, perhaps, or violence against Abraham, and yet it's a very bold encounter on his part. We don't know what he's thinking. We never get into his thoughts, and he just speaks directly here, and that's what we have to go with. So he begins this way. And as my note from Sternberg says about this beginning part here, he says, as a foreign settler, Abraham the Hebrew, noting how other people referred to him back in Genesis 14, does not enjoy the citizen's right to own or hold land. It explains, for instance, why the patriarch, so blessed with everything else, never attempts to acquire land except in the emergency of bereavement. Also explains why, quoting Sternberg again, he does not immediately address some individual landowner, but first applies to the community for approval and principle. So Sternberg, as is true throughout this whole passage and throughout everything he works on, in my humble opinion, helps us to really get into the situation, that he needs them more than they need him. He's got a body that needs burying, and they know that, and they have the land, and he has no right to it. So he begins this way, and as we'll see next time, it's ineffective and will require a regrouping. So he begins in the first person plural here. I am a stranger and alien. Another hendiadys here, Yervetoshav here, to say a stranger like Hagar, a stranger, but an alien like Lot was. That's what they accuse him of being, residing among you. And that raises a whole other question. We had seen that he was residing at Beersheba down here, and now we're told that he's an alien residing among them here. How can that be? Well, all we can imagine is that he spent time with Sarah mourning, and he's moved somehow into this area, although that won't be the case when the chapter is over, as he proceeds to try to find a wife for Isaac. So it's a very strange situation that he's telling them, at least, that he's residing among them. And if it wasn't true, they would certainly know it. But where could he be residing among them? Are we to understand that Beersheba is part of their territory? That's perhaps the case. Or perhaps he's simply outside of whatever town this is, because there's no wall or anything described here for this place. To know that there's no gates, for example, that he's standing at, as there were gates of Sodom. So we simply just don't know. And he starts off this way, give me property, in the imperative form, which is a very bold thing to say to strangers who he has no rights with. And the word for property is key here. I translated it differently here as possession, and that takes us back to 17:8, where it's translated differently. It can literally mean a burial holding here, but let's go back to 17:8 and see what the connection is. So this was Yahweh's promise here that's connected with what follows with circumcision, as you can see here. I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land where you are now an alien, all the land of Canaan, for a perpetual holding. And the word for holding here is the word that's at issue. The word perpetual just means for all time. But holding here, YHWH here. And it'll be the same word we see in 23:4, and I will be their God. So that's the specific promise there. But notice highlighting an alien in the whole land of Canaan. So that could perhaps be the case here, that the Hittites are Canaanites, and he's an alien residing among you in the land of Canaan. And it's only by going back to 17:8, linked by this word here, that we can make that connection. So among you, repeated twice here, give me property among you, and he really wants it there. And we could ask the question, which the text never does, why is he picking this particular place? Why these people, and what does he know? And we'll find out he's already done some reconnaissance, because a little later in the story he'll request that Ephron speak about a particular piece of land. So he's certainly done his due diligence, although as readers we don't know that as it starts. So he says, give me property among you for a burying place. This is the full phrase here, and we see it repeated a number of times here. burying place in the yellow highlighted throughout here, and that's literally the final word. So that here I may bury my dead. And notice that phrase, my dead, throughout. Again, that word dead, 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 bury my dead, bury your dead. Never is she mentioned as Sarah by any of these people here. Whether that's because it's impolite to mention her by name, or literally, as we see here, away from my face. Maybe I bury my dead away from my face. That he doesn't want to see her and he doesn't want to think about her. Plainly not because he's sick of her or anything, he just mourned and wept for her, but because he's just simply too sad. So in this sad and bereaved state, he's going to have to negotiate with these people to get them to give some of their communal land to him permanently. How in the world is he going to negotiate that when all the cards are in the Hittites' hands? We'll have to see how this complex negotiation begins to unfold next time. See you then for that. Bye-bye.